about at time, so might as well get started. Thanks for coming to this talk. I'm going to start off by introducing myself a little bit. I'm a senior engineer at Cypress. We make an open source test runner that can test anything that runs in the browser. I'm a co-organizer at Code for Atlanta. We run Civic Hack Nights, other types of civic tech events and hackathons. If you're in the Atlanta area, we are virtual for the next few months still, but hopefully in the spring we'll have some new events. You can come check us out. I'm a program developer at People Making Progress. That's a title that we made up when I stopped working there full-time a few years ago. It just lets me stay in touch with this organization. It's a nonprofit that works with adults with developmental disabilities. This is sort of relevant today because a lot of my experience of accessibility and the needs of disabled users comes from working directly with people who are relying on technology for their independence in one way or another. Certainly people who are experiencing barriers related to the software that we're creating as developers. So that informs the approach to this talk and the kind of stuff I care about, so we're going to talk a little bit about that too. These slides are online. This is mainly in case you want to follow along, but also there's a lot of links at the end. You can get them there. Just wanted to point that out. Roughly the topics we're going to talk about. At the start, quickly, we need to set up how we're talking about accessibility in this talk. I don't want to get into the weeds on this too much, but we should do some setup. So if we're going to talk about framework-specific implementations in Vue, we at least have a grounding in what our goals are, what we consider accessible, how we're judging that. That has a little bit to do with how we add accessibility into our process when we're doing our work day to day. So I want to relate accessibility to code quality and testing and stuff so that we can think about how it fits in the bigger picture. And then we're going to make a thingy. I picked out an awkward example of something that's not quite one thing or the other as a component. We'll take a look at how I implemented it and the process of thinking through the options so that we can keep it accessible, but also meet the weird design goal that we don't necessarily agree with. There's some stuff we're not going to talk about. We're not going to talk about automated testing tools for accessibility. We're not going to talk about audits like Lighthouse. Those things are really useful. Compliance with WCAG criteria is really useful. And understanding different edge cases among screen readers and browsers and operating systems is also pretty helpful. These things can also be kind of intimidating when you're getting started with accessibility. So for me, those are things we're not going to cover in this talk, and there's a reason for that. So for me, the version of accessibility I want to talk about is focused on this communication between you as a developer and a disabled person experiencing your website through assistive technology or using a keyboard to navigate your website, stuff like that. So it's really about making an experience that's fully usable for that person, and that is possible to uncover mistakes with automated testing and with criteria for how something should behave. But you can have a perfect score on all of these accessibility items and still not have communicated the idea that's in the web page. You can have pieces that are missing, you can have pieces that are wrong, and we can't automatically test for did you use good judgment as a developer to communicate what's in the content. Generally, who I think is here is people who aren't experts but want to do better. I feel like if you're already an accessibility expert, you may not need what's coming up in this talk specifically. But if you're someone who can get by in a front end, like a full stack developer who makes whole components and can make a front end work, I think this will be pretty useful. And if you are someone who wants to get over really basic usability threshold, oftentimes with accessibility issues, we do things in such a way that they're completely broken. They're unavailable for somebody using a screen reader because they're not announced correctly. They're not reachable by the keyboard. These users can't tell us that we did a good or a bad job. They just don't know the stuff is there. So we really have to get to a threshold where we're communicating something that makes sense, that's usable, but we're not trying to be perfect. It's way more important to me, on a practical level, that we set someone up to be able to perceive everything they can do in a web page, even if we've made some mistake and we've done something that's not perfect and like takes more clicks than it should or something like that. We need to take steps to at least get stuff functioning and usable, and then we can iterate on that and receive feedback. So for me, working on the front end, I try to conceive of accessibility as a part of code quality, which takes us to what is good quality code and what's the point of a web app. And a lot of this question of like, what's the goal of a web app? Generally, it's to put the right content in front of the user at the right time. We have a whole stack that goes all the way back to the database and the API and everything that leads to the currently active DOM in the front end of the web page. And that's the thing that's supposed to be right. Based on who the user is, what permissions they have, what their account status is, whatever, we're supposed to be showing them the right thing at the right time. So how do we measure that we're doing that? There's two ways that we usually check that something was done. So hypothetically, you work at a company, you've received a ticket to build out a certain design, you create that design and somebody clicks around and uses it and approves the ticket. And that's sort of a visual impression of whether it's working correctly. But that's not checking if we made the correct HTML be in the page at the right time to make this component make sense. And we'll talk in a second about why that's important for accessibility. But to me, functionally, definitely the application should look right. It should go through the right paths and the right states. But it's like a single page application like we write in Vue should reflect the state of the application in the UI. That's a lot of the magic of these front-end frameworks. The application state is like creating the UI, and the application state's correct if the HTML and in the DOM at the time reflects the nature and structure of the content correctly. So this avoids a weird coupling. We have, in certain cases, especially when making awkward thingies, we can create something that is only functional visually. An example of this is we take our design that we've received. The design kind of encodes some ideas about the relationships between the elements. We might see big text as titles. We might see sections that are distributed by space and related by different sizes. We might see images that go with text that are grouped together visually. And if we simply build that design out with totally generic elements, divs, spans, what have you, then we're making that design, that implementation, coupled to the organs the person has who is experiencing it. That feels weird, and that makes it feel to me like a code quality issue. We don't want our front end to be super dependent on what kind of database is implemented. We have an adapter layer that communicates to the front end what it needs to know and takes messages back and deals with that and sends that to the back end, and the right stuff happens over there. So on the front end, if I'm asking users, hey, definitely have eyes and definitely have them working to a certain standard so that you can perceive the difference that a designer placed into this design, that's a dependency. And it's a sort of hidden dependency. And typically in code quality discussions, we don't want dependencies between unrelated concerns. The other code quality aspect is when we write automated front-end tests. One of the pain points in front-end tests is having them be brittle because our selectors for elements, which we'll take a look at in a second, but our selectors can be based on CSS, based on DOM order, XPaths that go to all sorts of places. And so when someone changes the way a component looks and they move something around in the DOM, your test starts failing because it can't find a thing to click on anymore because your selector was not meaningful. This way we can use the accessible name that every interactive component should have, build that into our tests so we can preserve the accessibility as we work. So this brings us to when the DOM matters, test it. We're going to look, as part of our example application, we'll look at a bug that we can fix with a test, or we can test for. But basically, here's an example of a single line of a Cypress test that finds a button labeled close and clicks it. And this idea of linking the test to the label of the button is so much more useful to me as a test than finding something with a class of close, finding something with a special data attribute for testing of close, or finding like the font awesome icon that is a multiplication sign and clicking on that. So that doesn't mean anything, that's like creating the X that you click on. But if we build into our test, find the button that's labeled close, even though that label might be in the DOM through like an ARIA attribute or through a hidden piece of text that we can display, it means the test will verify that it stays there and your accessibility work is depended on by the test. And if you break that test by changing the HTML, well, it should fail because you broke accessibility. One of the most useful tools for judging if something is accessible is the accessibility tree. It's built into the browser. You can use it from DevTools. It's created from the HTML that you ship into the browser. And so it's a garbage in, garbage out situation. If what you put in there are generic divs and spans, that's the type of thing that's perceived in here. The reason the accessibility is so useful, our accessibility tree is so useful, is that this is the API that assistive technology uses to determine what it's going to describe to somebody visiting the page with a screen reader. What is it going to turn into Braille for somebody experiencing the page that way? What's it going to announce when you reach interactive elements so that you can tell what's going to happen when you press that button? And this is a feature of the browser I didn't know about for a long time. And when I looked at it, it made so much sense to me. I kind of want to share how it looks. We'll do a quick example using it, because if I have this available to me while I'm working on a component, I have a really quick way to understand what am I actually telling the person that is experiencing this through assistive technology. What am I telling them about the web page? You can see in the top left, I could be telling someone this page is made up of boxes. They're in some order, but the relationship between them, what's a container, what's a heading, what's a list, is not clear. At the bottom, we can see with semantic HTML, we're creating things that are meaningful in the accessibility tree. And that's stuff that can be communicated through. This is the channel that communicates from you as a front-end developer to somebody using assistive technology to perceive the web page. So we'll look at Google Slides. So the way to get to this is the same way as we get to most dev tools. It's a bad place to right-click on. All right. So we open our inspector, make it a little bigger here. Down in the part that I usually think of as the CSS area, we have some other options, and one of these is accessibility. So we're this close to understanding what is being created from our HTML for disabled users using assistive technology. And we can inspect parts of this. Let's look at this menu. So there's all kinds of stuff in here. We understand we're inside the application menu bar. We're on a specific menu item. We can sort of click through. These are the labels that are on these things. There are parts of this interface that don't have visible labels. But this button is labeled Open Comment History. So if you encounter that with a screen reader, it's labeled Open Comment History. And actually, honestly, if you encountered this without a screen reader, I had no idea what this button does. I've never pressed it, never wanted to. I don't know what a box with an arrow in the bottom and some lines in it means. So I would like this text to actually just be there. But we do have hover text that does the same thing. So we won't get into the weeds on that, but this is a really useful tool if you're not already aware of it. I struggle with this if I want to evaluate a whole application or a whole page. It's not quite like the DOM tree, you close things up, things disappear. You have some ARIA stuff down here that's really interesting, but I can't really use this as an auditing tool or something. It is most helpful when I'm developing a component in isolation and I want to understand what that component's doing. Sometimes at a glance, you'll see something really weird in here. And that weird thing, weird string of characters, buttons that have no labels, something like that, those things will stand out if you're looking at that part of the accessibility tree. So before we get to our example, we look at a couple of foundational patterns that we're going to be using. How about we get rid of this DevTools? There are like 3 or 4 categories to me of user interface components and patterns that we see on the web a lot. The first is pretty easy to get the accessibility right. We write semantic HTML, headings correctly structured, lists are lists, buttons are buttons. Forms, quite complicated forms, can be managed for accessibility really easily with just plain HTML. Especially if nothing's changing dynamically, we can get a really accessible experience for news posts, blogs, articles, forms, all that stuff, just with HTML. Then there's conventional interactive JavaScript stuff. These are things that most web developers, most of the time when you have to implement an accordion or a carousel or a tab list or something, you're going to pick something off the shelf from an open source library and use that directly. You probably already have something like this available in your design system or use Vuetify or something. And these things are known, and so you can describe to somebody with a screen reader, hey, here's an idea of tabs, and here's the state that it's in. Here's the tab you're on, and you can go into the panel of the tab. And all of that is like usually prepackaged for you. And then there's these thingies where you receive a design and you just don't know exactly what you're looking at. I used to work with a designer at an agency who was really creative and really awesome, and I liked him a whole lot, but he would want to push the user interface kind of beyond what you normally encounter on a web page, because he wants something distinctive for the clients that we had. And so a simple tab situation wouldn't always be quite enough for him. So working with him, I created some thingies, and looking back, they weren't that accessible, a lot of interactive diagram type things, but it was tempting because he would have some animated, flowing, beautiful thing. When you would start to work on a feature like that, I'd be like, okay, let me get this working. Let me deliver this cool experience that was designed that I'm implementing. And then once that's done, if there's time later, we'll go back in and we'll make sure it's accessible. And I think that's a workflow a lot of us follow. So I want to suggest a different order of doing things here when you're creating like components that do something a little bit unusual in a common scenario that we're in as developers. So here's the example. The context is we might be working at an agency like I was, and we're providing something that's going to be used in a CMS. So this is a layered diagram. Each instance of this can have different content. Authors can go into the content management system, create new ones. They have to be able to add all the little details to it. Each layer of the diagram is an image. We're going to zoom in to the next layer as we scroll. Each image is going to have little dots you can click on that expand into more content. And the content itself that you expand might have some more stuff you can do. So let's play this example animation file that we might have received from a designer like this. So we're looking at it, it's interactive, woohoo. We're going to scroll and we're going to see something lift off. Very nice, okay, more dots have popped in. We can check out this dot. It's not going to be a giant surprise. In a minute we're going to scroll again. And now we have the bottom level of the image. And we have some more dots in here explaining facts about avocados that I looked up for this talk. This is the behavior when we scroll back up. So the layers are getting put back on top. It's tough to find an example that is awkward enough to justify a non-standard implementation, but simple enough to get through in a short talk where we can actually talk about the surrounding details. So this could be more fancy. This is kind of where I decided to cut it off. But I want to talk about why this is a thingy. Why this is not obviously something specific. When I look at this, a few things immediately come to mind. Like maybe this is sort of a carousel. The transition is a little weird, but maybe this is a carousel. But then there's interactive stuff inside of it. And when I think about a carousel or a content slider type interface, usually we're seeing an image or a video, and I'm not like expecting to have to dive in and click around some more stuff in here, but there's no other controls. At this point in the flow of this feature, all I know is this is happening on scroll, and it's happening like probably while there's an article or something, and you get to different sections about the avocado, and it shows you that section, and it's kind of a glossy catalog feature. It's not something that is like nuts and bolts important content. The reason I think it's tricky, and when I actually took a pass at implementing this with a more basic structure, the part that's most tricky to me is this. We're in between two states. We're still seeing the last slide, and it's moving. And if we scroll the other ways, this one's going to come back and land on top. But all these other patterns in accessibility that we might be able to use have kind of one state at a time. And we have no controls apart from the scroll. So this is weird. And once we encounter something kind of like this, it's really tempting to just make it. Just make it, make all the stuff work, especially if we're under pressure. The part that I think is important to focus on here is when we do that, we're maybe sidestepping the control that we have over someone's independence when they use it. So from people making progress and working with people using various interfaces and needing help, anytime that we create something where someone needs help to understand it, we've just reduced their independence, and that's a really tangible impact that we have as front-end developers on the experience people have on the web. It's super important to me, so I wanted to mention that, and we'll come back to it. So I'll break down the questions I would come back to this designer with. I didn't have all these queued up back when I worked there, but I have done conversations like this since then. I would like to understand the goals of the widget, because my job as a front-end developer is to figure out what's the right HTML for that thing. If I'm going to make it correctly, no one else is telling me what HTML I'm supposed to use, what component from some component library. That's kind of our responsibility. It's our world. And generally, other people in the company, even if they like accessibility or something like that, they're not going to be too much in our business about what the markup needs to be. So what are the goals of that widget? What does it do with reduced motion? In the previous video, we saw that as you zoom in, you kind of lift off the top layer, and it's sort of clear what's happening. We're going within the thing that we just saw. But if you have reduced motion turned on, and you visit something like this, a lot of times what happens is the animations turn to 0 seconds or 0.01 seconds or something like that. Because someone might have motion sickness or whatever, we don't want them to experience the motion, but then it snaps between states, and it's not clear that like there's layers or what's happening really. So bringing that to a designer's attention can help reveal like what is the real nature of this thing that we're building. And for that matter, could we add some controls? What's the keyboard experience likely to be when you encounter this component with a keyboard? If you have no interactive controls that can drive it, it's probably not going to achieve its goal, because that person maybe is going to be focusing through parts of the page, the scroll's happening automatically, they're going to sort of miss it if they're using the keyboard to navigate, unless they're a rare type of person who would like to hold the down button and patiently proceed through your animation at a crawling pace. So asking these questions, as well as how to describe this over the phone. So I like to think that like, if you needed to take a feature and get someone on the other side of the phone to understand what it is, how it works, what they're able to do, what is the relationship between all the content, all that information that you would need to give them to understand it over the phone is what should be in your accessibility tree. That would probably be sufficient for somebody navigating with a keyboard to have all the controls they need, because you're going to say something like, there's a menu button, there's we've all been on the phone with family members and had to tell them to click the 3 dots, right? What are the 3 dots? That's very, very unhelpful if you're encountering that with a screen reader. So describing what happens when you open the 3 dots, it's a menu, whatever, that all helps. And then finally, there's some compromises you can make. Every now and then you'll encounter situations with design or branding where it's not possible to get everything you want. and go back to a designer and say, this should have all these sort of controls and all these focus styles. In the real world, it's okay to have a compromise that gets you over the threshold of basic usability, even if you do something like, okay, we have tabs, but they're only going to appear if you are using your keyboard to navigate. Sort of like a skip to main content link, where we can have something that's like a fallback for the accessible needs. It's not ideal, but if you work in agencies and you have a busy day and you have a lot of projects overlapping and people are resisting doing something accessible, it can be shorter and faster to do this, not be perfect, it's all right. So we're going to get towards the Vue implementation. The goal is HTML enhanced by interactivity. This is really useful for our authoring interface in a content management system, as well as a fallback when there's no JavaScript, as well as maybe like a transcripty version of this widget that will just describe the content. So seeing everything else as a progressive enhancement of that. We have interactivity that can be enhanced by motion. So the second level of this is we want it to be interactive to switch between states, to open and close the buttons, but we know some users are going to have preferred reduced motion turned on, so we need to have it not depend on the designed animation to communicate the idea of layers. The nature and structure of the content and anything that's possible to do should be perceivable at all times. And it should be usable with the keyboard, with the screen reader, with reduced motion. This is kind of a narrow vision of what it is to make an accessible component. A lot more to it. We're not talking about color contrast. There's all sorts of stuff we're not talking about. But this is the stuff I want to focus on. When we have this idea, we can think about existing pieces that we can compose to make something that works. So this is not any one off-the-shelf component, but you could sort of see a case for nesting something in this. And depending on the conversation with the designer, depending on the controls you were able to add, maybe you could make this a carousel that actually has the back and forward buttons. Maybe you could make it so the back and forward buttons go up and down so you can sort of tie it into the scroll, stuff like that. So you can get creative about what you can compose as candidates for making this work. And the starting point is getting your content into the HTML to show you what the nature of it is if it didn't have any of the movement, if it didn't have any of the state, if it was just, here's the information I want to give you. In a little while, we'll fire up a screen reader. We'll take a quick look at two different versions of this and what information is apparent to a screen reader and the stuff that we're losing when we make it interactive. So anywho, my implementation decisions here were that this was closest to a tab switcher. One thing is active at a time. We're coming in, we're doing more interaction than we would with a carousel. It's conceivable there could be lots of dots. There's no limitation on that of what a person could author and what could be nested inside of it. So it's a tab switcher in my implementation on the outside. Within the tabs, there's a normal disclosure widget that you might use for like a tooltip or something. But yeah, tabs only show one at a time. So semantically, it might be a tab switcher, but in reality, we have this overlapping state between one part and the next. So we end up with this to serve all those needs. Plain HTML version gives us this backup transcript version. Lets content authors see what they're doing. So we'll get to that in a second. The interactive part of this is using two different off-the-shelf accessible components that you can get, open source components. I picked two that are like independent of major component libraries, and we need to use something like the accessibility tree or built-in screen reader that we have access to determine whether we really believe that these are accessible. A lot of components will say they have accessibility and it's just not there, stuff like that. We have the green sock animation for motion and scroll behavior. So it took me a while to think of how to separate that out from the tabs and then connect it back in so they work together. But we have some Vue reactivity that can be the connective tissue between our layers implementation and our tabs. So we'll take a quick look at this. Did I close? No, I didn't. All right. There it is. The avocado thing. So let's start with the basic HTML version. If we were using Nuxt or some framework like that where this is rendered on the server, or we were doing this in like the old CMS I used to work in, which was Adobe Experience Manager, you have like a Java template that renders out some stuff. We could grab all our data out of the CMS, put it into a plain HTML version, and if JavaScript never loaded, this is okay. This is still like way more than you would get in a lot of other situations. So we have the pieces here, they have headings. As we're thinking about this version, it's also like, helps us to think about what section headings do we need? There's no section headings in the diagram, but like if we're making something interactive and we want the buttons to be meaningful about what's going to happen, we probably need titles for the section. Likewise, if we look at this without the like subtitles here, it doesn't make as much sense to me as like raw HTML content. So I show you the code for this. It is not very long. I think as you're iterating on a component like this and you're setting up your data and you're authoring tools, which might be like a bunch of forms that let you add, here's a piece of this, here's an image, here's a layer, here's a dot that goes on the layer, here's more, like iteratively add pieces to it, and you need to render out something to see what you're doing. I think this basic HTML, in the structure of this page, it has a H2, there's a subtitle here. This is not strictly perfect semantically. There could totally be improvements to this, I'm sure. But we have an article element for each thing. The article has a header, there's a UL, an LI, so we have this structured list. And we can already see there's some weirdness here. There's no alt text for this image. We'll talk about that. But this basically renders out some totally straightforward, regular HTML. And if we can remember how to open VoiceOver, we'll take, hooray. This could be noisy for a second. All right. So now we're here. There's a couple of features you get with the screen reader that make use of the accessibility tree that are not your standard keyboard navigation. If you haven't used one before, this is VoiceOver, it's built into the Mac, and I think that this works like this. Busy? Come on, what is busy? You can tell this is one of those old Macs. All right, we're here. Chrome busy? Let's refresh. That's hilarious. Chrome busy. Not very not helpful. So we'll take a quick look at the accessibility tree. We might give that another shot in a minute because we're going to have to fix something and test it anyway. So if we come back to our plain HTML version, in the accessibility tree, looking at this part of the component, this is the stuff that would be exposed to screen readers. You can see things like this. Buttons, headings, paragraphs, articles, this can be grouped. You can navigate between stuff like this as like landmarks. So I can open up that thing I was trying to open in a screen reader, and it'll show me all the links, it'll show me all the headings, and I can jump between them like through this other interface without following the tab order, so I can skim the document, which we often do naturally. We just scroll and we skim. So that's what's presented there. Here's the scroll implementation. Make this a little bigger. Actually, that might get weird. Let's do this. So we scroll in very gently. Things are weird because of the toggle JavaScript button. All right, so now we're in between. Get to the next one, get our interactive stuff again. We come in, we're in between, we're going back and forth. This is the sort of thing that I see getting designed out there when somebody wants like a flashy landing page or something. A lot of things end up being controlled by scroll. There's one thing you might notice we've added, which is these things here. This is my solution to a minimal idea of what the layers are. As this changes, we're moving between layers. If we were to use our keyboard to get to this, we can pick between these with our arrow keys because these are like tab controls. So semantically under the hood, this is a set of tabs. And if we pick the next tab, if I didn't make scrolling so weird here, yeah, pick the next tab. Nope. Sorry about that. A lot of refreshing happening in this page, but here we go. Tab navigation kind of works. We can get in there. We can get to specific stuff. We can follow our way all the way to the deepest nested content. And so when I'm evaluating whether something works purely from a keyboard perspective, regardless of what's announced to screen readers, I really want to know, can I tab my way to every link? So everything, no matter how deeply nested, doesn't disappear from the keyboard, because this element here with the eye inside of it is a real button. It's not a div that has a click handler, which might not be exposed to a screen reader. I mean, to a keyboard interaction. So we get this benefit from native HTML. We're able to stack these components together. We'll take a quick look at how that is implemented in our view component. So here we are. If we're in the tab version, we have this tabs component, which is just imported from the library that provides it. So I don't know too much about the internals of this component. I Googled View 3 accessible tabs. This is the component that came up. It looked okay to me. This is an okay starting point. So we have diagram data. This is the stuff that comes out of our CMS. We have all sorts of dialogues and things that might be editing this. This could be authored, this can be changed. We're creating the points that appear on the image. I've worked in places where we've done things like this, where you use just X and Y to render out something like this that's an interactive dot that has more stuff that needs to go in a diagram. So the author can say, this should be 40% in, this should be 40% over. That's where this dot will appear. They can change that as they need to. But one of the things you need when you're creating this kind of data in a content management system is, at least in the one I used to work in a lot, you would have something like this open, and you would go through and see, like, did everything appear here? Or right at the end where we explain about the ticking time bomb inside of every avocado, did this image get put where it was supposed to be put? And if you have a JavaScript component like this and you don't detect authoring mode and offer a fallback, it can be really tiresome to make an edit to the content, go to the component, go to the state you need, open up that thing, check if your content is there. So in this situation, I would be rendering plain HTML on the front end for the content author so that they can see all the stuff they authored, make sure it's okay. The ideal thing to be here that's not here is the dots should also appear on the image so that they can verify their X and Y coordinates were actually correct. So this is the implementation that I went with. I don't think that this is perfect. There's a couple of bugs we're going to find right now, but I think this is usable. I think somebody could complain to me about this because it's not ergonomic for them in some way that I don't understand because I don't use a keyboard every day to get around the web. And that's the threshold I'm trying to get us across in this talk. So if we look at a part of this, I think I have a slide for this, right? Yeah. We're going to notice a bug with the accessibility tree. We'll fix it with our view template. We'll use VoiceOver to make sure that we actually fixed it and can perceive the thing we're trying to fix. And then we're going to update our test. So I have a little front-end test in Cypress that's asserting some stuff about this page. If we have an accessibility bug like this, and our test is passing, that's a problem that I want to fix. It means that somewhere we're selecting something that's not dependent on correct accessible behavior. So we're missing out on this like free baked-in accessibility that we could have. So if I come in here, still have accessibility tree open, we'll look at this button. And already it sticks out weirdly. Like, what is that circle thing? If we take a look at other things that are labeled, this is a string, right? This is a avocado. This is the button that's called toggle.js. The tab list is called avocado diagram. In tab panel, there's that thing again. So this is labeled, but it's labeled with a string that is a circle because I wanted to make a little circle icon and I used the Unicode circle and I just colored it with CSS. So I have no idea what this sounds like if we hit it with a screen reader. We'll be brave. We'll try it again.
No comment. Google Chrome. Mark. Window. Off. No comment. Entry. No comment. Web content. Toggle J. Link. Black bar circle. Avocado diagram. Tab. Chrome. Has new window. Your tab panel. You are currently on tab panel. Link.
Did that say black large circle?
To click this link, press Control Option 6, voiceover off.
All right, so we heard black large circle. That does not tell me what's going to happen when I click that link. That's super confusing. And when we go back in here, nothing is called black large circle. It would be weird if we looked in here and the title of every section was black large circle. That's not what we'd expect to see. So we need a way to get these titles exposed to the screen reader, but not mess up this design that we've been asked to be implemented in this specific and awkward way for the purposes of the presentation. So the way to address this is, first of all, we can hide content like this from a screen reader. It's really common in a lot of code bases to have, wait, this is the wrong way to do it. Yeah, this is fine. So now we can go back and we can say this element, using the ARIA structures you may have heard about, you can do a lot of good and bad things with ARIA for accessibility. We're going to say this element should be hidden from screen readers. And when we come back to our accessibility tree, we'll come in here, and it just no longer, let's find out if this is really true. Yeah, no longer has a label or anything. It just says ignored. Inside a link, there's just an ignored node that is not going to be announced. That's okay, but then we just have something that's called a link, and it's not super descriptive. So we have a number of ways we can address this on a button. Because this is a tab component that renders a link, it's a little unclear to me exactly how attributes might be passed down. So we're just going to put in another span. And it's going to be the same thing that's in our HTML up here, where we have our sections, layer.name. And first, we'll just leave it in there. Ooh, okay, well, that works. That's fine. But really, that's going to be not functional. Unless you're able to argue with the designer that controls should have visible labels all the time, in which case, great, clean this up and you're done. I would prefer that solution, but sometimes we have to keep it visually the way it needed to be. So we have a screen reader hidden class, or screen reader only class, that you can use, that's a part of a lot of code bases. Now we have our tab list is labeled with these details here that come from that content that we have people authoring. And if you're able to sort of conceive of these controls happening at the same time as you set up your content authoring in your CMS, at the same time as you think about your testing, you can require your content authors to include stuff like this that might not be visible, but that you need for accessibility. So if they don't submit a label for the tab panel, they don't have to know that's the implementation, but if they don't add a name to the section, you're able to not validate that form, so they can't submit it. If they don't have an alt tag for an image, you can not validate that form, so they can't submit it, so that we're able to teach people your sections need to have these things. We're going to use this text for some users. And you can enforce a lot of that stuff if you're able to do that. So what was happening with our test? Why did we have a passing test for this, which you have not seen yet, but let's run it now. So our front-end test, not everybody has seen front-end testing. There's a lot of tools to do it. This is one. I'm partial to this one because I work there, but it's not the only way to test the front end. This will click around and do some stuff. So this is Cypress. This is going and doing some very basic things. We have a test file that's written in JavaScript that describes what this is going to do. And we might have an only. Yeah, we have an only here. So generally, this is spinning up the component. It's going really fast, but it's going through. You can see it's looking at stuff, checking did stuff happen. This is really useful if you want to be validated that your front-end behavior is correct across changes you make. So I typically will write my front-end tests right after I do like a really hacked together implementation to get something to work. Especially if I can get something to be accessible and work, but not meet the visual requirements yet. Then I will write my test to make sure the functionality is preserved. Then I will finish off the component and make sure that it's doing what it's supposed to do and looking right. And even then, the code underlying this might get changed in code reviews. Things might still happen to the code, but my tests will tell me if it's working or not. It'll tell me if somebody changed a div to a button to a div and lost the free keyboard behavior that comes with having a real button. So I really like that feature of what we can build into testing for free. So let's see why this is passing. We're getting something here, right? We're clicking on this and we're trying to see what it does when you click these things. So I'm going to change this tab control interactions work test. We're going to say only run this one. And let's look at how we're finding something to click on. It's pretty clear that in here, we're getting the thing that's labeled avocado diagram. That's good. We know we have an accessible ARIA label on this thing. There are other ways to use label text to get your elements. And then inside of this, I've left myself a hint here. We're getting the second link, and we're clicking it. So whatever the second link is, inside of this thing that's labeled avocado diagram, we click that. That just so happens to be the right thing to open up the next part of the popover. That will give us the mesocarp part of the avocado that we can test. So we're going to make a quick change to this. Now let's find out what this label is supposed to be. Flesh of the fruit. Is that the mesocarp? Okay, good. So we're going to grab this label. And we're going to use it in our test. So instead of this selector stuff that's based on the DOM element it happens to be and the order it happens to be in, we're going to say side contains. We still care about this part. We still want a link, but it should be called flesh of the fruit. And let's see if our test will pass. Yes, we can see we found that element, and we didn't have to jump around the DOM. If we add or remove things in our test data that's populating this component, that's okay. We're still going to find this. Our following assertion about the thing we should see when we click on this thing, we talk about the mesocarp, that's going to be fine because that's nested under this in our data. So we're able to hook into the accessibility stuff we're doing to bake it into our tests. And then our tests are more resilient because they actually are bound to things that matter to us when we're selecting interactive elements. Every single interactive element should have an accessible name. By hook or by crook, you can get one in there. There are a lot of techniques in front-end testing where you will use data test or data test ID or data sci to identify elements that you want to target. I would say only do that in elements that you're wanting to not interact with, but you want to perceive how did they end up looking. So there's not really an accessible name for the div that you want to check if it got the warning class in the error state. So go ahead, data test attributes for all those things. But if we have an interactive element, it's supposed to have an accessible name. If you can work out in your code base how to grab that accessible name without writing it as a literal string, even better. You have a test that is not going to be flaky. Even if the label changes, it's going to be checking for the right label. We have another weird selector here. This is weird. Why did we have to do this? We're finding the one that doesn't have a tab index. I'm not going to go into tab index right now, but that's a weird thing to have to do in a test. This is because of the way that the headless UI component that I use to make the popover thing inserts things to the DOM and hides them. So this was a way to get that button to click, but it totally is not targeting the accessible part of this. We would do the same thing, and we can see that in here, this button kind of suffers from the same problem in the accessibility tree. Come over, got a button, and it's got something that's already ignored in there, but it has no label. So we would do the exact same process we just did. All right, we are coming up on time. Here's a quick tour of excuses and reasons that people don't do accessibility. We're not here to scold about any of that, but the important thing is, as front-end developers, this is an expression I picked up that's used a lot at Code for America events. We're the ones deciding what the HTML is. No one's coming. No one's going to prioritize accessibility, right? In the backlog, it's not going to be part of your product requirements unless your company's been sued, in which case it's really important to everybody all of a sudden. And they're going to be asking, hey, who wrote the HTML that got us sued? So It's pretty important for us to get this right, not just to protect our companies, but also just to communicate correctly to people using assistive technology. We'll sum up really quick. Accessibility is driven by the HTML. Our choices directly affect the independence of people using our software. I used to work with a guy who was a disability officer for a college. He was a wheelchair user himself. He could do everything independently. I was his PA, and I would type for him, and I would open doors for him, and I would unpack complex packaging for him because he couldn't move a lot. But everything that he could do for himself, he did for himself. And he was specifically needing to ask me to help with certain websites or not because of the content of the DOM of those websites. So it's super important. It's more connected than you might realize to the potential for someone to do something independently or not. Use existing patterns directly when you can, and a list of things to think about for Thingies. Here's the slides. Here's the links. These are the components we use. There are a lot of good view components that can give you accessibility that you can evaluate with the accessibility tree. Here's some stuff you can do after this talk. People making progress. The organization I mentioned at the start is a nonprofit. Donations are huge for us. So please donate to PMP. If you're in town, come see us at a Civic Hack Night at Code for Atlanta. Also, Cypress is hiring a ton right now. So if you're interested in working at Cypress, let's chat. Go to our jobs board. Take a look at it. We probably don't have time for questions. I think we're done. So thanks, everybody. Really appreciate it.